Yvonne has agreed to be an advisor on the Commercialization Advisory Board for CMAT, so we really look forward to working with her in that way. I am going to allow, so Yvonne is part of this Pabst patent group. She's an attorney with them, and Georgia Tech has a really good relationship with this group. They've done a lot of pro bono work and have had office hours over the years with some of our researchers. So this is just a really great relationship that we want to continue to have. So I'm going to hand it over to Yvonne. And Yvonne, if you could talk a little bit about your background and how you landed at the Pabst group, that would be great. But thank you. We look forward to this. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Cindy. So as Cindy said, my name is Yvonne Shyntum. And with respect to my technical background, I graduated from Emory, I believe, 2005. It's such a long time ago, with a Ph.D. From the pharmacology program. And, like many graduate students, while I was at Emory, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I knew I didn't want to be continue with bench research. And so I used to attend some of these talks that tried to help students figure out what they wanted to do. And I got introduced to patent prosecution. So shortly, maybe about 2 months before I graduated, I got contacted by Pabst Patent Group to see if I was interested in joining them. By that time, I'd heard a lot about what patent prosecution was about, hadn't done it before. But the good news for me was that they were willing to train me. So right after graduation, or shortly before graduation, I joined Pabst Patent Group as a scientific advisor. So I started doing that. A couple of years into that, I took the patent bar, which is a bar exam that is really specialized for people with science backgrounds, giving them the authority to practice before the patent office. And some 4 years or so into doing this, I thought I liked this job enough to invest the time to go to law school. So I went to law school in the evenings while I worked during the day and graduated with a law degree. Eventually, I am now a partner at Pabst Patent Group, and our law firm is a small specialized law firm. We're highly specialized in the life sciences. The people that work here typically have a Ph.D. in some life science subject or another. I am happy to be here today talking to you, and I appreciate all of you who've logged in for taking the time to log in and listen to this conversation. And I'm going to briefly set my timer here so I know I keep track of what I'm doing. Now, my aim is to provide a high-level discussion of the patent prosecution process, highlighting aspects which I hope may help you as you think about designing your research strategy. So we're going to be talking about the basics of patent prosecution, what is patentable, the journey from your idea to the patent office, what is patentable. I will highlight enablement issues, obviousness issues, and how examples can help you overcome this during prosecution. Now, before we continue, the usual disclaimers. The ideas in this presentation are mine. They're not from my firm or any other lawyers here. This presentation is meant for information purposes only, and it's not intended as legal advice. And please, it's intended to be interactive, so interrupt me if you have questions. Now, before we begin, just a brief overview of what a patent is and basically why do we care. A patent is a business asset. It is important because it's a very important business asset. It's a legal document that is given to inventors by the patent office in exchange for them disclosing their invention, and it gives the patent owner the right to exclude others from making, using, selling, or importing the claimed invention into the patent jurisdiction in the U.S., into the United States. And the invention per se is defined by the claim. So you can have a long patent document, and what is really important that lays out what the intellectual property is the claims, and it's that novel and inventive composition, device, component thereof, method of making, or method of using. Now, there are 3 types of patents that you can file in the United States. You can file a utility patent. This protects the functionality of compositions methods. You can file a design patent, and this basically just protects how a thing looks, not what it does. And you can file a plant patent, and this is for people that are in the business of asexually reproducing plants. Now, these next set of slides discuss some initial questions an inventor should address, the responses to which would lay out a foundation for a solid patent application. The responses to these types of questions are very important as well for folks in the university, because one of the routes by which you get to have a patent application filed is by submitting an invention disclosure to the Technology Transfer Office. If you can ask yourself these questions and have responses to them, that would be persuasive for the reviewer looking at your invention disclosure in deciding whether they're going to file on it. And it will also be persuasive to a potential partner if you are in a small company and you're trying to partner with someone. The responses to these types of questions would help them determine how important this is and where it can go. So typically, you start with what are you protecting? You start with an idea. For university folks, your idea is you have a hypothesis which you test. You conduct experiments and you prove your hypothesis, and this typically results in a manuscript. Now, in your manuscript, you describe exactly what your hypothesis was and how you tested it. For an invention disclosure, though, or a patent application, we have to describe the idea in an expanded fashion, not in a narrow fashion. So you're thinking about what your potential partner could be interested in within the scope of your discovery, what a licensee can market, and you describe it in that manner because this adds value. We put inventors and your patent drafting attorney in the business of trying to anticipate the future. You have to think of where the technology will be in 5 to 10 years and try to describe and cover that. I know it's a concept that is maybe difficult to understand because people sometimes push back and say, hey, I haven't tested that. I'll explain to you why that may not be so important. You have to determine what is it that you want to get a patent on. Is it a composition or is it a method? If it's a composition or a device, a composition, we're going to use composition to call anything a thing. And if it's a composition, what are the prospective products? One of the very important considerations that you have to make is why would the market care? Because again, like I mentioned, this is a business asset. And so you have got to be able to market it. And you ask yourself the question, are you solving a long-term problem? Are you lowering the cost of a product? Is it easier to make, less expensive to manufacture? Can your invention be used to do something others have tried to do and failed? And if the field is very crowded, sometimes it is, does your technology stand out compared to the rest? These considerations and questions are very important because they help you, posit your invention disclosure in a manner that is attractive. Now, another pre-filing consideration is who the inventors are. And the reason that I address this is because sometimes there's confusion between who an inventor is and who an author is. Now, in the United States, at the very least, and Europe, for those of you interacting with artificial intelligence, AI cannot be an inventor. It has got to be a real person. And an inventor is someone who contributed to the conception of the claims, what it is that you're defining as your invention. So if you're working solely at the direction of a PI, you're just following directions, that doesn't rise to the level of an inventor, although you could be an author on a paper. Now, inventors may be joint. To be a joint inventor, all you have to do is contribute to at least one claim. The contribution doesn't have to be the same. You don't have to be in the same, you don't have to work together or at the same time. So long as you contributed to at least one claim in the patent application, you are a joint inventor. Now, what are the implications of joint inventorship? Joint inventors have a joint and undivided interest in the whole of the patent. What this means is each inventor has the right to sell and or license the technologies. This is different from real property, where you need for all parties to agree to sell. For a patent, if you're a joint inventor, you have the right to, sell, exclude others, and to sell and license that property. Now, joint inventorship determines ownership, because for university folks, for example, or people working in companies, typically your employment contract lays out the fact that you have to assign your inventions to the entity employing you. So the inventorship, therefore, determines who is going to own the patent, and ownership determines who has the right to exclude others from making, using, or offering for sale that invention, importing it into the United States. Now, again, I continue to harp on the issue of inventorship because this has caused so much contention. You can't even imagine, from where people don't understand why they are not inventors, where people over-include, on when people are being taken out of something that should have been theirs. If you understand the importance of inventorship and why we should have the correct inventorship, then this may solve some of these problems. So in the US, there's a legal requirement to list the correct inventors. So you cannot add inventors that were not inventors. You can't remove people because you don't like them that are supposed to be inventors on your patent. You can't add your friends, and some people have added their spouse on a patent application. They have to contribute to an aspect of the claims. Now, the good news is that if there's any mistake in the inventorship, it can be corrected during prosecution. Prosecution is basically just the whole process of going from when you file to when the patent issues. So we can correct the inventorship if we discover it is wrong. If we left out someone, we can add them. If we added someone who shouldn't be there, we can take them off. You can actually even correct it when the patent issues. And the whole reason, minus the legal requirement, is the monetary implications of who the inventor is. Of course, the inventorship determines the ownership, and ownership determines who can exclude others and therefore make sales and or get loyalties from licensing. So inventorship is a very important concept, and if, like I mentioned before, if folks understand why you are an inventor or not, that would be very helpful in adding people or in stopping people from being really offended when they get taken out of applications. Sometimes I have to make that recommendation and explain to someone why I need to take them out because they really don't rise to the level of an inventor. Now, we will go to the basics of patent prosecution. Now, for university employees, all of these initial considerations are followed by the inventor drafting an invention disclosure, which they forward to the Technology Transfer Office to determine if the university should invest the funds for a patent application. Universities cannot file on every disclosure that comes before them. So they have to make a determination on the likelihood of success and the likelihood of marketing the technology. So the next set of slides should provide some insights with respect to how you position your disclosure. If you position your disclosure anticipating and addressing potential questions that arise during prosecution, I believe that would impact how a reviewer makes their determination of whether to go forward or not. So I'm going to take you through patent drafting, the journey through the patent office. If we are successful after the journey through the patent office, you get something called a notice of allowance, where the patent office says, oh, I agree with you, you do have an invention. Now, the surprise for folks can be you go in saying, hey, I have an invention. It is not an invention until the patent office goes through the criteria that inventors must meet to, in order to get a patent, to determine that you have an invention. So they may agree with you or they may disagree with you. If they agree with you, you get a notice of allowance. And even after that patent issues, you have to pay some fees to the patent office to keep it alive. Now, with respect to patent drafting, again, very high level, the parts of a utility patent application have a specification. It has claims. This is what, again, you're saying you invented. It has an abstract, and sometimes it can have drawings if the drawings are important in understanding what the invention is. By contrast, the parts of a design application, you just have one claim. And I give you an example of a claim for some technology that we prosecuted. We claim an ornamental design for a flexible heat sink as shown and described. Now, the bulk of a design application is really the drawings. with respect to the specification, you see I underline must. The specification must expand on disclosure from the inventor. We sometimes receive pushback from the inventor when we extrapolate their result. The inventor will come back not understanding what we did, and they'll be like, they'll tell us we didn't do this. We never tested these aspects that you've added. The issue is really whether you would expect it to work. So we take your disclosure and we ask the question, would you expect it, if it worked in one cell, say you're trying to convert cells, if it worked with fibroblasts, do you expect it to work with adipocytes? If we expect it to work, if it's feasible, we would add different types of cells in the disclosure. So if the response is yes, you expect it to work, and we did not include it, you will get a patent with claims that are commercially worthless because others can very easily design around the claims. Again, what is a patent? It's a business asset. If you have a business asset that is worthless, it really is not that good of a business asset, is it? Now, I would like to highlight for you the differences between patent application and a journal manuscript, because for university folks, you are in the business of drafting disclosures for publication. Now, understanding these differences is helpful when you review a draft patent application that is forwarded to you, and you understand, and for those that are reviewing the application, you would understand why we put stuff in there. And for folks that do not get included, you may understand why you were never listed as an inventor, although you spent hours and hours in the lab. Now, excuse me. Now, a specification has these components which are absent from a manuscript. You can draft a 40, 50, 60-page patent application with no examples. A manuscript, by its definition, when you're publishing something, you have examples. You have a hypothesis, you test it. You can have prophetic examples in a specification. You can't have that in a manuscript. It's real examples, real things that you tested. A prophetic example is an example that you include in an application, and you say, oh, hey, you could use this to do this, but you haven't really done it. Now, a specification has claims and a manuscript doesn't. The claims, again, at the end of a specification tell you what it is that the invention is. Now, authors are not necessarily inventors. I have mentioned this before. One big confusion that comes into play is when you spend a lot of time to decipher the mechanism of action of, say, an agent. That discovery of the mechanism of action can be so important that you win a Nobel Prize. It may not be patent worthy. People can not wrap their minds around this sometimes. This is because if the basic claim is already claimed, the patent office doesn't care about the mechanism. The patent office doesn't care about the mechanism of action. It would be nice to have it there. Now, if the mechanism of action leads to a claim, then yes, the person who discovered the mechanism of action can rise to the level of an inventor. I tell you a very brief story. I was involved in an inventorship dispute, and the postdocs actually requested my review. The postdoc had spent hours and hours, and there was a publication deciphering the mechanism of action of an agent that the PI had discovered could be used to in obesity. Now, the PI had made this discovery 4 years before the postdoc came into the lab. You can imagine their shock when I did my review and I told them, I'm afraid you're not an inventor, because that link between this agent and obesity was discovered 4 years before you joined the lab, and the claims are directed to a method of administering that agent to treat obesity. There is no claim in this application that is talking about that has anything to do with your mechanism of action. Now, another difference between a patent application and a journal manuscript, a manuscript is narrow, it's limited to the stuff that you tested. A patent application has got to be broad. The manuscript is basically talking about the present. A patent application has to be forward-looking. Now, in patent drafting, we have to look at the prior art. We have to draft around known prior art. So inventors typically are aware of the closest prior art. You are the experts in the field. You're working with this technology. So if you're aware of the prior art, it is good to disclose it and distinguish it, with respect to how are you different from the prior art. Now, sometimes we discover in a search that, the inventor had disclosed, say in an abstract, and you forgot to mention to us, at that point, my recommendation is always to stop, because if you had disclosed more than 1 year ago and you disclose exactly what we're planning to claim, you're barred by law. The patent office is not going to grant you a patent. They're going to cite that abstract against you. Now, one of the things that we consider, again, when we're drafting, it's always very easy for someone to tell me, oh, I'm novel, I'm new, nobody has done what I did. That is very easy to articulate. What is a little bit trickier to articulate, and it's important to articulate, is why are you not obvious? Inventions typically are piecing together known elements in a novel and non-obvious way. So it is important to lay out in the patent application, if we can, why you're not obvious. Comparative data is important. So inventors that are constantly filing patent applications should build into their research strategies the idea of having comparative data. It helps to show advantages. It helps to show criticality. Why did you select these concentrations? Why did you select these doses? Why did you select this dosing regime, for example? Telling the story in the application, laying it out, makes it easier during prosecution for me to proceed or for me to succeed. Now, what could go wrong in a typical patent application? Remember, I told you it's good for the patent lawyer to draft a broad application. Sometimes people fall in the trap of drafting an application that is too narrow. If your application is too narrow, you could be limited to that embodiment and you would get claims granted. The patent is useless. I'll give you an example. Your discovery is that you can convert fibroblasts to liver cells using what is phospholin? Why did you use phospholin? And you tell me that it's because it's a cyclic AMP activator. What I should do is draft in that application that we're using cyclic AMP activators to convert fibroblasts to liver cells. And you as the inventor, when you get that disclosure, you should allow me put in that disclosure, because if it's possible that you could use phospholin or another cyclic AMP activator or a phospholin analog, we should disclose that. If we don't disclose that during prosecution, a patent examiner will say you do not describe anything but phospholin, and they would limit us to phospholin, and you would get a claim that is to a method of converting fibroblasts to liver cells using phospholin. Well, your competitors would just design around that claim and use a phospholin analog. Because you never described it, you could not claim it. Now, you have situations where people are overly enthusiastic and they draft very broad claims. You run into the danger of, overlapping with the prior art, and or the examiner can find a prior art reference that says you are not enabled as broadly as you claim because these embodiments don't work. They normally need to support that with some sort of literature. You can also have situations where the inventor hadn't really gotten there yet. They hadn't discovered that yet, and the drafter was overzealous, and they draft a disclosure that stops the inventor from getting a patent in the future. I'll give you a real example that happened to me in prosecution. We were prosecuting an application where the inventor had discovered how to load nanoparticles with drugs up to 50%. Drug loading. It was remarkable that they had this discovery. So we're going through the patent office and we're like trying to tell the examiner no one had been able to do this. It was remarkable. This is unexpected. You couldn't do this. Here are all the difficulties that the inventors overcame to do this. Now, a different patent application by the same inventor drafted by a different lawyer, that application was concerned with methods of making nanoparticles of specific sizes and size distributions. Now, the patent lawyer in the process, or the patent drafter in the process of drafting that application, did not limit the disclosure to that to the methods of making and or the nanoparticles, as they shouldn't. They should also disclose how the particles could be used. Well, in the process of disclosing how the particles could be used, they disclosed that you could load the particles with drug from 1 to 99%. Needless to say, the examiner cited that same inventor's patent application against us. And of course, I knew it was drafting error, but that was prior art. It was the inventor's own prior art, and that basically killed this application that we were trying to draft. Another problem that people run into is not building into the application fallback positions. What do I mean by that? Going back to our phospholin example. If you use phospholin at concentrations of 5 and 10 nanomolar. It is my job to not just disclose 5 and 10 nanomolar because that may be what you are limited to. We disclose ranges. Let's say I say you're using 10 to 100 nanomolar, and I don't disclose any other sub-range. I don't disclose, say, it could be 10 to 100, it could be 10 to 90, it could be 10 to 50, it could be 10 to 20. And then an examiner finds a prior reference that is using 90 nanomolar. And then I come back to the inventor and I say, would you use 90? Typically, sometimes the inventor will be like, no, we don't care. It's not necessary to get to that point. If I did not build in these fallback positions, I don't have a choice. I can't claim anything but my broad range or the very narrow concentrations that you used. So other dangers are using terms that no one knows. They're not ad-recognized terms, or using subjective terms that with no definition in the application of what objectively, how am I going to determine this property? Now, when we're done with drafting the patent application, we have to file the patent application at the patent office. One of the recommendations, a very strong recommendation that I have when I'm talking to university folk, I know there's a lot of pressure to publish, and sometimes stuff gets published as soon as you submit it. So we recommend filing before you disclose. Now, in the United States, there is a grace period of 1 year that inventors are given where your own disclosure is not going to be used against your claims. In other jurisdictions, however, such as Europe, there is an absolute novelty requirement. They will cite anything you published even 1 day before your filing date against your claims. Now, why do we care? If you're not careful about publishing before filing, you foreclose the possibility of foreign filing. You lose foreign rights. And remember, what is the whole purpose, again, of you trying to get a patent portfolio is to be able to market it and get investors to be interested and or licensees. If you foreclose the possibility of foreign filing or the jurisdictions in which they can have monopoly, you make your portfolio less attractive. So, let me just go back one slide. Sorry, this is the slide that we're supposed to be at. So when we're done preparing, of course, then we file. You can file a provisional application, which basically puts your stake in the ground. This is not examined. And you ask the reason, why do you do this? The rest of the world, and the US included, is now a first-to-file jurisdiction. So the first person to file is the first to invent. You can file a provisional application sometimes when you're still fundraising, when you're not ready to commit the funds, and you're still experimenting and you're trying to meet with potential partners. Sometimes you can go straight to a non-provisional application. When you file a provisional application, it's not examined, but you have exactly 1 year to convert it into a non-provisional application. So you can file a US national application that claims priority to your provisional. Claiming priority means, although you're filing 1 year later, the office cannot cite any intervening publications or patents or any disclosures against your claims because your filing date is the date of your provisional. You can file an international application through the Patent Cooperation Treaty. This is where people file. You're not sure yet in which jurisdictions you want to file. You can file a PCT application. So at the Patent Office, the progress starts, the office takes your filing and they look at it and they determine, do you meet all of the formalities? Have the inventors filed a declaration? Signed a declaration. Do you have a power of attorney? We can file applications at the Patent Office without a power of attorney, but that affects whether or not we can file certain papers like terminal disclaimers. So the first thing they do is look for, do you meet formalities? Are your drawings reproducible? And you can get a notice from the office if you don't meet some of these formalities to correct them. Then they look to see if you present more than one invention. In the United States, you can only get one invention per patent, so you cannot claim 2 different methods. They will issue something called a restriction requirement, and they will require you to elect one group to prosecute, and you can always file the next invention in a divisional application. And then we go to examination on the merits, where the examiner is now looking at your claims to determine, do you really have an invention? And they do this by examining, do we even have patentable subject matter here? Is the invention adequately described? Is it enabled? Is it novel? Even if it's novel, is it obvious? And when they do this determination, they issue their findings in a writing. We call it an office action, which is basically a document where the examiner lays out why they're going to give you a patent or why not. And our applicant is given an opportunity to respond. Now, what really is patentable subject matter? So basically, you can patent a composition of matter, machines, manufacture, you can patent a process. And your claims must be directed to subject matter that the courts must not be directed to subject matter that the courts have found as exceptions to patentable subject matter. And this includes abstract ideas, laws of nature, natural phenomena. And the reasoning basically is that these are basic tools of science. And if we grant people monopoly, the U.S. government granted people monopoly over these basic tools of science, would be stifling innovation instead of promoting it. Now, the office, this is just a brief overview of what an examiner will go through to determine if you have patentable subject matter. First, they establish if your claims are directed to the 4 criteria I mentioned for things that we should be granting patents to. If yes, they then determine if you recite an abstract idea, a law of nature, of natural phenomena, and I'll show you an example of this. And if the answer is yes, they make another determination. Is that all you're claiming? If that is all you're claiming, then you're trying to monopolize these basic tools of science, and you should not be granted a patent. So what really are abstract ideas? Now, these are mathematical concepts, certain methods of organizing human activity, mental processes. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying you cannot have claims that recite abstract ideas. You cannot just be monopolizing, claiming the abstract idea per se. Another exception is the laws of nature, and I provide you here an example of a claim that recites an abstract idea and a law of nature. If your claim, for example, is to a machine comprising elements that operate in accordance with F is equal to ma. Now, this claim sets forth the principle that force equals mass times acceleration. This is a law of nature. So this claim is implicating a law of nature exception. And F is equal to ma, it's a mathematical formula. So this claim implicates an abstract idea. If this is all you're claiming, you're basically trying to monopolize a basic tool of science, and the office is not going to allow you to do that. So with respect an example of a claim that I prosecuted is now an issued patent, and I'll tell you why. When I said you cannot monopolize the product, the exception per se, but you can recite it in a claim. So this application had to do with DNA polymerase that was isolated from organisms in the deep sea anoxic brines of the Red Sea. Now, this DNA polymerase can sustain a wide range of salt and metal ion concentrations. Now, you all know about PCR. DNA polymerases are used in PCR, so it's important for us to keep discovering DNA polymerases that can survive very harsh conditions. When this claim, the application was transferred to me, the claim recited a DNA polymerase composition for amplifying nucleic acids comprising an isolated DNA polymerase comprising sequence ID number 3. So the sequence ID number 3 was basically the amino acid sequence of the DNA polymerase. But that is a naturally occurring compound. So of course the patent office said, nope, we're not going to allow you monopolize a naturally occurring compound. Then we amended the claim when we responded to say it comprises the sequence ID number 3 and a buffer. Examiner came back and said, that is too general. You're still monopolizing the product because you're saying, no one can take this polymerase and put it in any kind of buffer. So eventually, I have a conversation with the inventor. Again, if you recall, initially I started by telling you have to determine what the product is. I asked the inventor, how would you sell this DNA polymerase? What would you put it in? And he told me most likely in some buffer. I would transport it if he wanted to send it to someone in glycerol, because glycerol is known to protect DNA polymerase. So when you identify what the product is, it helps you to amend your claim to include elements. So now I was able to add EDTA, of course, I was limited by what was disclosed in the specification. 3-HCl, diethiotriol, and glycerol, which took this claim from me trying to monopolize DNA polymerase per se to claiming a composition that either was no longer a natural product or was a combination of natural products when you combine it with glycerol, but now the product had different characteristics. Now, another consideration for patentability is description. You've got to describe what it is that you invented. So the specification must have a written description of the invention in sufficient detail so people can conclude that the inventor invented what they claim that they invented. I'll give you an example. Let's say your invention is that cancer patients with upregulated levels of phosphorylated protein do not respond well to chemotherapy, and you find out that phosphorylation at a specific serine, say serine 52, causes these patients not to respond well. Well, if no such inhibitor, so you draft your claims and you say you're improving cancer treatment by administering to a subject a specific inhibitor of p53 phosphorylation. If no such inhibitor exists, you haven't described what the invention is. In other scenarios, if you are delivering, say, cell therapy compositions, and you say phoscolin improves their survival in vivo, and you draft your application and you say, oh, you can use phoscolin, you describe other cyclic AMP activators that you can use, but you never thought of inserting the word into your specification phoscolin analogs. You cannot later go back and amend your claims during prosecution when you discover your inventor, or when you discover that this analog works best, it works better than phoscolin. You can no longer amend your specification to claim that analog because you did not describe it. The next consideration is enablement, and you will not be granted a patent unless you describe how to make and use it to ensure that the invention is communicated to the interested public in a meaningful way. This requirement ensures that the inventor meets their own end of the bargain. Remember, you get a patent in exchange for disclosing what your invention is, and the reason is because inventions almost always result from improving on what somebody else has disclosed. Now, there's a set of factors that the Patent Office uses to determine whether your claims are adequately enabled, and I'm not going to go through the factors, I just list them here for you. So one of the big ones that I had mentioned is the breadth of the claims, and although there is a desire to have broad claims, you can run into problems of adequate support and enablement. That doesn't stop us from trying, though, because prosecution is a bargain with the Patent Office. You go in asking for much, and you try to see, you whittle it down to what you can get after the examiner has gone through their necessary considerations. Now, one of the other considerations that they take with respect to enablement is the level of ordinary skill in the art. If the level of skill in the art is high, you need to describe less. So, for example, can we use mRNA in vaccines? Yes, we can. Today we can. So if your discovery is a new antigen that you can use to deliver using mRNA, you describe less because the level of skill in the art is high. You don't need examples for there to be for you to satisfy enablement. However, examples are critical if you're dealing with an art where things are unpredictable, where the art is not well developed. If you're trying to claim a genus, representative examples are necessary. By a genus, what do I mean? I keep going back to my phoscolin example. If your discovery is that you can use phoscolin to convert cells, the genus is cyclic AMP activators. So if you're going to claim cyclic AMP activators instead of phoscolin, which is actually what you tested, it may be important to provide examples to more than the phoscolin, just one species from the genus. So examples can be important when you're trying to claim a genus. So the next criteria is novelty. This is an easy criteria for people to understand, and it's straightforward because you have components in your claim. You're claiming A plus B plus C, and you just look to the reference to see whether it discloses A plus B plus C. You can only use one reference to establish, the examiner can only use one reference to assert that it's novelty destroying. You cannot combine two. Now, a concept that is confusing about novelty is inherent disclosure, because sometimes an inventor would look at a disclosure and say, well, they don't disclose this particular element. Sometimes the disclosure is inherent. It is not explicitly disclosed, and that is sufficient for an allegation of lack of novelty. I'll give you an example. Their claims are to a hemihydrate compound, and there's a patent that had disclosed an anhydrous form of the compound, and the process of getting through to the anhydrous form of the compound necessarily involved making the hemihydrate compound. There is therefore an inherent disclosure of that hemihydrate compound. And even if the prior art did not recognize that they made the hemihydrate compound, if the examiner can prove that they necessarily by going through those steps, they made it, they can cite that reference for inherent disclosure. Now, anticipation is straightforward. Obviousness is a little bit less straightforward because it can involve some sort of subjectivity. And here the examiner merely looks at prior art references to C. You claim a composition, for example, comprising A, B, and C. The examiner finds a reference that discloses A and B, doesn't disclose C, finds another reference that discloses C, and they can allege that the combination of these references makes your composition obvious. And they do. Now, the same kind of inherency that I mentioned to you before can be used to support a conclusion of obviousness. Now, applicants do have tools, though, to combat this allegation of obviousness. So we ask the question, are the elements really present? That's the first thing. You never take an examiner's assertion for a fact. You look to see if that prior art reference, the reference that has been cited, is interpreted correctly. Did the examiner provide a reason why one would combine them? This avoids the examiners using hindsight after having seen the applicant's application to make their conclusion of obviousness. Did the examiner pick and choose portions of the prior art reference? So basically using our application as a roadmap, and then looking at the prior art to say, oh, reference A discloses this embodiment, reference B discloses this aspect, so one would combine them and arrive at our claims. They are not allowed to do that. They should provide a rational reason why one would combine. And so we can argue that we have unexpected results, or we have superior properties or properties that are not present in the prior art. This is evidence-based. That's why examples can be so important. Sorry, didn't mean to click over. The examiner cannot modify a reference to change its principle of operation. The examiner cannot modify a reference to make it unsuitable for its intended purpose. Again, going back to that patent that I discussed that was to an anhydrous form of the compound. If an examiner says, hey, look at this patent that disclosed an anhydrous form of the compound, and other people knew that the hemihydrate form is important, therefore one would be motivated to make the hemihydrate form. My argument would be, it is not obvious to do that because you would be changing the principle of, you'd be making that patent unsuitable for its intended purpose. So those of ordinary skill in the art do not just make modifications. You don't make modifications that will make the discovery unsuitable for what it was meant for. If your invention is meeting a long felt but unmet need, which is evidence-based, this is a very good argument to argue why your claims are not obvious. If the prior art teaches away from the claims, the most obvious cases where they make disparaging remarks. They say that compound A will not work. And if you use compound A and it does work for the purpose for which you used it, this is a strong indication that it's not obvious to select that compound. Now, so the progress during prosecution, when the examiner makes all of these determinations, they lay them out in an office action. They issue a first office action. That's what we call it. It's a document from the office telling you why they're not going to give you a patent. Then an applicant has a chance to respond. You can revise the claims. You can use evidence to support arguments, publications, experimental evidence. So you can show unexpected results, long felt but unmet need during prosecution. You can use declarations. In fact, you submit the experimental evidence in the form of a declaration. We can conduct examiner interviews. These are just invaluable, especially when examiners get a chance to talk to inventors and hear from the inventor's perspective what the differences are with the prior art. And then the examiner can agree with you or not. They issue a second action. The second action, if they agree with you, is a notice of allowance. That is very rare. Possibly it's going to be a final office action. And sometimes people see this under, the panic. Is it over? No, it's not over. You can respond to this second office action and get to allowance. You can, if there's no agreement, you can pay a fee to the patent office and say, hey, I'm requesting continued examination. Let's start again. Or if you think you're not going to be making a lot of progress with the examiner, you can file a notice of appeal. Sometimes people abandon their application because you look at the facts and you think, it's going to be difficult to get this particular set of claims. Let's file a continuation, which is filing another application at the patent office, which basically uses your same specification, and you can present a new set of claims, or you file a divisional, which is a set of claims that were divided out by the patent office. Now, when you file a notice of appeal, you can go straight to appeal at the Patent Trials and Appeals Board, but that is a very expensive process and it takes time for you to get a decision. So the Patent Office came up with this pre-appeal brief review program where you file a notice of appeal and they appoint a panel to review your arguments again and see whether there's something we can move forward through this process. Either they can allow the application, they can determine that, no, we are not going to allow it because there's really issues for appeal, or they can reopen prosecution. If you go to an appeal, you have to file an appeal brief, which is a document to the appeals board, which establishes why the examiner was wrong. The examiner gets a chance to respond. It's called an examiner answer. You get a chance to reply to that, which is called a reply brief. And optionally, you can choose to go in front of the patent office and for 20 minutes have this nerve-wracking process where you have 20 minutes to tell them why you think you should get banned. Then you get a board decision. They can agree with the examiner. They can disagree with you. The applicant the appellant can request review of the board decision. If the board disagrees with the examiner, the applicant wins. It goes back to the examiner, and the examiner should allow the claims. The board can also raise new issues which the applicant must address. Now, if everything works out and the office agrees with you, you get a notice of allowance and you pay your issue fees, your patent is issued. You can decide to continue pursuing other aspects of your invention in a divisional application or a continuation application, which is basically, again, the same specification with different claims. After your patent issues, you have to pay mandatory maintenance fees with the patent office. If you don't, the patent is going to expire for failure to pay maintenance fees, and you can no longer assert your patent. However, the good news is by paying, if this abandonment was not intentional, you can pay a fee and revive it. So I have come to the end of this long discussion, and I hope that I have shed some light or changed the way you can think about your research, taking into considerations what is important during patent prosecution.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. That was excellent. I know I have a lot of questions still, and I think there are some areas that particularly confuse a lot of researchers, largely around enablement questions, and we have some great questions from the audience, and we have a good 10 minutes to discuss them. So I'm going to go and read through them in the order that they were put in the chat, and but they're really good questions. So the first question that we have is, there are detailed requirements on what must be disclosed in a patent application. But what requirements are there for provisional applications? Are the requirements different? For example, does a provisional need to fully enable the invention?
Yes, because if a provisional doesn't enable the invention, you can't claim priority to it. So that is the danger when people file very quick provisionals that don't provide much, and you fall into the trap of an examiner looking at that provisional application and saying, you're not entitled to priority because you did not enable that invention. Now, remember, it doesn't take, depending on the type of art, you could file a very short provisional that is enabling because the art is mature, it's not that unpredictable. So I give you an example again of the mRNA vaccines. If you've discovered a new antigen, you can file a very quick provisional that says, hey, you can use this in an mRNA vaccine, and basically cite literature that shows that people know how to make this and briefly describe how one would make and use a vaccine. So you can have a short document that is enabling. You can also have a document that is not enabling, and that would cause problems with respect to claiming priority.
Okay, I'll just add to that. So I get, you can have prophetic claims. How do you enable those?
You can have prophetic examples. So you can have prophetic examples, but not prophetic claims. So I use that word in terms of examples. Let me give you an example of what a prophetic example is. So I discover, again, using mRNA, I discover a new antigen. I say that we can use it to deliver this antigen using mRNA in a vaccine. And my prophetic example is that you can administer that vaccine composition to a subject in need thereof to elicit an immune response. It is enabled because people know how to do it. So I haven't really done it, but it's enabled because people know how to do it. A prophetic example is not enabled if people don't know how to do what it is that you're saying in the example.
So what if you have a composition of matter that you have not actually, it's maybe in your genus, but you have not really looked at it, or you don't have any data on it? Can you do that? So
that's a very good question, because when you have a composition of matter, you should be claiming the genus and the subgenus. There is no requirement that you test every member of your genus. There is a requirement that you enable, in order to claim a genus, you have to enable and describe a representative number of species. So the examiner has got to come back and tell me why my genus is not enabled. Using my phoscolin example again, if all I tested was phoscolin, and I say, hey, you can use any cyclic AMP activator because I think they're going to act similarly, the examiner may come back and say, this is not true because I have this reference that shows that this phoscolin analog doesn't behave like phoscolin. Without such evidence, they cannot just allege because they want to that my claims are not enabled, because within reason, one would think that phoscolin and a phoscolin analog would have the same activity. So if I tested phoscolin, I don't necessarily need to have tested the phoscolin analog.
So the next question is very similar. When you describe the invention in the patent application, isn't that enablement? How can the description not be enabling?
The description I'll give you a good example of when a description, for example, is not enabling. So, you describe an antibody. You say that, I keep going back to vaccine formulations because this is where we run into a lot of trouble with the patent office. You describe a vaccine formulation and you claim that this formulation would provide protective immunity. And you describe the formulation, you've described the thing only by virtue of what it would do. We don't know what the thing is. We don't know what the antigen is. So one of ordinary skill in the art would have to test, do a lot of experiments. Let's say all you say is that it's this protein, it's a certain protein from a virus, and say this is our antigen. We all know that you cannot take just any aspect of a virus, of a viral protein, and get protective immunity. COVID is a good example. In order for us to get some sort of protective immunity, they had to go after a specific protein and possibly a specific part of that protein. So if you just say you get your vaccine formulation confers protective immunity, and you just send those of ordinary skill in the art to a hunting expedition to go and start figuring out for themselves what aspect of this virus would provide protective immunity, you haven't enabled it. because you're telling people to just go determine for themselves what aspect would work.
Okay, we have another question about enablement. Given the challenges of tech transfer,
Go ahead, Cindy.
Yes? Sorry? Yvonne, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. This is also another enablement question from Todd Solchek. He says, given the challenges of tech transfer between two willing parties working together, how can complex patents ever be enabled? And maybe
Can you
Todd,
repeat that, please?
So Todd, maybe do you want to unmute and ask this question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Yvonne, this is really fantastic. Thank you. I was always troubled by the concept of enablement because I've seen it so many times where party A wants to transfer technology to party B, and they work closely together, and yet they still have lots of troubles. And yet the patent is supposed to describe what to do for anybody skilled in the art. So in principle, all you need is that patent, and then you can go and reproduce that product or that invention. And so to me, it seems like the patents aren't fully enabled, especially in complex areas like biotech.
You're right. Sometimes patents aren't fully enabled, and that's why when parties try to assert some patents, they fail, right? So because the claims are drafted so broadly that not everything that was described would work. Now, remember, when I started talking, I said patent drafters are put in the position of predicting the future, and you can be overzealous sometimes. So using my example of the nanoparticles, where you discover how to make nanoparticles of a certain size, it's a very important discovery. And then the patent drafter says, hey, we can load these nanoparticles with drug up to 90%. That's not possible, right? So if that is all they disclosed in the patent application and an examiner actually allowed them claims to 90% drug loading, when they go to assert those claims and they find out somebody's infringing their claims, one of the biggest defenses against patent infringement is to say, oh, your claim is invalid. So they come back to you and they say, your claim is invalid because you cannot load nanoparticles up to these particular nanoparticles with up to 80% with drug. And typically they will have experiments to show that we cannot do this. So the best way for claim drafting is you have broad claims and then you layer your claims in your dependent claims with narrower embodiments, which can withstand a challenge of either enablement, prior art, and stuff like that. So you're trying to predict and bargain with the patent office to get as much as possible. And when you do get it, you run into the danger that it's vulnerable to attack. But you defend yourself against that by having fallback positions in your dependent claims. So typically people they don't try to assert their broadest claims. They assert the narrower claim which actually covers their product. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
So we have, we're almost at 12. I think we have time for one more question here. I think you covered, there's a question about mechanism of action, which I think you covered quite well. Here's another question. When the examiner is assessing prior art, is any prior art that appears in the public domain after your priority date during prosecution fair game for consideration when assessing patentability?
No.
Okay. And then he goes on to say, or is prior art only relevant prior to the priority filing date?
Okay. So I said no, and I'm going to modify that. Prior art is what came before you. So what came before your priority date. So that's what the examiner is going to look at. Now, how is what comes after you relevant? What comes after you could be relevant to show why you're not enabled. So let's say you're claiming that you can use this one antigen to vaccinate against any kind of virus. And then people later publish that it's been so difficult to vaccinate against the Zika virus. And your claims are to an immunogenic composition against viruses. The examiner can use this post-filing reference to show that I don't think you're enabled for the breadth of that claim, because here is publication showing that your invention doesn't work as broadly claimed. So that is one scenario in which a post-filing reference can be used against your claims, is to show a lack of enablement.
Oh, great. Well, we are at 12 noon. I want to thank you very much, Yvonne, for really an excellent, excellent lecture. And for those folks who have signed up for office hours, we will be starting with the first group right now. But thank you very much, everybody, everyone else. Thank you so much for your great questions. And thanks, Yvonne, for that really good lecture.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.